Hey everyone, we're going to keep on talking about free markets and we are going to talk about water. Water is an interesting product of all the products on Earth because one, it's probably the product that humans need the most, right? Like everybody's got to have water, but it's also an interesting product because it is an item that we often run out of. We're often having water shortages, even in the developed world, in places like Texas, California, Australia. There are often times where there's like a real shortage of water. Lake Travis a few years ago was real low. We were worried about having enough water for boaters and farmers and drinkers of water who lived in Austin, right? And eventually it rained and the problem is a little bit on hold now, but this is like a recurring problem in a lot of parts of the developed world, water shortages. And, right now we've got a few other shortages because of coronavirus and toilet paper and blah, blah, blah. But for the most part, we don't have shortages of things like we do with water. Grocery stores almost never run out of stuff. Even right now in the midst of the coronavirus, they're like still holding up pretty good. It's kind of amazing, right? With cars, it's not like, there's periods where like you want a car, you can afford a car, you've got the money, and you've got to wait 6 months because there's not enough cars. That doesn't happen. There are shortages of almost no products in the developed world in the United States except for water. There's like always shortages coming and going of water. Why? Well, the answer is probably that water is not sold on the free market. It is not privatized. It is pretty much run by governments. And governments underprice water. Now, why do they underprice water? Well, they're probably trying to do the right thing for their people. They don't want to charge people an arm and a leg for water because, well, everybody needs water, right? So governments charge too little for water. But what happens when a product is underpriced? It often has shortages and runs out. So I want to dive a little deeper into this story by talking about the state of California. This is California, and this is a map of aqueducts and water flow in California. So a lot of water in California is flowing out of these mountains down through Sacramento, where I used to swim in that water in the American River there, in the Sacramento River. And then it flows into the bay, and then it goes into the ocean, and all the fishies swim. But they built these aqueducts that go down to LA, or really one big aqueduct. This was built in, I believe, like the 60s and the 70s. I actually found out a few years ago my grandfather was an attorney working for the state of California, seizing land through eminent domain from farmers. And that was used to build this aqueduct. Here's a picture of it. I used to see it when I was driving down to Los Angeles every now and then. It's massive. It's hundreds of miles long. It's just basically a man-made river that takes water from central California to southern California. And most of it's going here. This is Los Angeles. Ain't it pretty? Brings me back to my 20s, cruising around Los Angeles, stuck in traffic. Those were the days. And here's the thing. So this water goes to LA. People in LA drink it. A few years ago, we started running out of water. And there's another place that a lot of this water gets used, which is farms in the Central Valley of California. Now, here's something a lot of people don't realize about California. It is a massive agricultural state. By most measures, the United States is the largest agricultural country in the world. France probably comes in second, and California, if it was its own country, might be the third largest agricultural producing country in the world. A lot of food that we eat and that the United States eats and that the world eats is grown in California. It's got great soil, great weather. It's really an ideal place to grow agriculture. And about 15 years ago, Southern California really just started running out of water. And the government had to make a choice. Who gets the water? These guys or these guys? And these guys are important because there's humans that live here. And these guys are important because they're farmers and they have businesses and they rely on selling their food. And the food feeds the world. But there's probably more voters here, so they decided that these guys are going to get the water. And they cut off water from a lot of farms in Central California. And I drove through the Central Valley probably in about 2006 or 2007 and noticed that there are all these signs that I'd never seen before that farmers had put up saying, What you are looking at right now is a government-created dust bowl. And there were barren farms as far as the eye could see that looked like this. Farms that my entire life as I drove past, they were thriving farms, and now they were not. And it's because the government decided LA is getting the water, not the farmers. Farmers were ruined, farmers went out of business, and food prices worldwide probably were higher because there was less agriculture in California. Now, had we been in a free market world, had water been privatized, this probably wouldn't have happened. Farmers could have just paid more to get water. And then that would have forced people in LA to pay more for their water. And whoever bidded higher would have probably got the water. But you know what would have probably happened before that? People wouldn't have moved to LA. The reason people moved to LA is because, water wasn't a problem because they built the giant aqueduct. If they had never built that aqueduct, water would have been so scarce in LA and so expensive to move to LA that I suspect LA would look nothing like this. And I suspect Houston wouldn't look anything like Houston does, and Phoenix, Arizona wouldn't look anything like Phoenix, Arizona does, and probably less people would live in Austin, although Austin has access to underground water, so maybe that would change things. But if water was privatized, it would not be running out. We would not have these scarcities of water, and you would not have a government just arbitrarily choosing to give water to these guys, not these guys, right? Another thing going on with water is there's a lot of countries in the world that just have dirty water, right? And governments have not been able to really provide that clean water. So there's even an argument that if water was privatized, it might get to the developing world quicker. You might get cleaner water quicker to the developing world. Food is starting to get to even the furthest, poorest corners of the earth. And the free market and privatization of food has done a pretty good job spreading that around. Same with cell phones, as we've talked about. It spread like wildfire. In just a few decades, cell phones have reached some of the furthest, poorest places in the world. Well, water's still a big problem. Why? Maybe because it's not privatized. So why don't we just privatize water? Well, how do you privatize water, right? Like, what would that even look like? Like, are we talking like all bodies of water are now privately owned? So what, do I just get to buy a stretch of water on the Mississippi River and that's my stretch of water? That's not going to work, because if some guy has a stretch upstream, he could pump out all the water before I get it, right? He could take the water before it gets to me. So do we just have to sell off whole rivers? Well, could you imagine like one company owning the Mississippi River? That's even kind of impossible, because now like all these rivers that feed into the Mississippi, you could just steal it before it gets to the Mississippi. So do you own like, does one company own like all of the water like east of the Continental Divide? This is crazy, right? Because then even like the water that ends up in these rivers starts in the street in the middle of a city, right? So privatizing water is virtually impossible, especially if you're going to just have no government part in this at all, right? So because you cannot privatize water, you end up with all these other problems, and the solution becomes very difficult, because this is something that is pretty much unprivatizable, right? So this is a problem with the free market, is some things, in a sense, do not work on the free market. They can't be privatized. They can't be totally on the free market. So now let's talk about a product that also probably can't be on the free market, or really shouldn't be on the free market. And this is private prisons. So prisons there was a big movement a few decades ago to privatize prisons in the United States. A lot of them were privatized. And this probably shouldn't have happened. So you go back to Locke. You might remember Locke said the government should do three things and three things only. Have a system of contract law and property rights, protect nations from outside invaders, and have a military and whatnot, and protect people from each other, right? Part of this would be providing prisons. Now, okay, what would it look like if we just completely privatized the protecting people from each other part, right? Well, that'd be crazy. Now we're gonna have like private police forces. We're gonna have private, like all of that's private. That seems a little crazy. So if the government's gonna do some of it, it's hard to privatize the other part of it. Once you start mixing government and private, a lot of these virtues of privatizing things on the free market don't work anymore because you have the government hand in it, which gives that possibility of corruption, which gives that possibility of, misuse and mismanagement. The benefits that we get from having something on a completely free market kind of go away when you start to mix and match the free market with the government, right? And what happened with the prison example? Well, probably ended up leading to more prisoners. And, if you had made this argument 40 years ago when they were trying to privatize prisons, it seems like, yeah, how could you end up with more prisoners, right? If you just privatize the prisons, how would that possibly lead to more prisoners? But it probably did, right? It doesn't seem like it would. It's not like the prisons are the ones out there arresting people, but the people who own the prisons pay for lobbyists. Those lobbyists might lobby for stricter laws and mandatory sentences and things like that, and those end up leading to more criminals. So part of the prison problem in the United States may have been indirectly or even directly contributed to by the privatization of prisons. But prisons were privatized in the name of the free market. The arguments being made for privatizing prisons were like cost efficiency and things like that. But this is something that a lot of economists would argue should never have been privatized in the first place. And even Locke probably would have argued this one shouldn't have been privatized. I don't know that for sure. He's not around anymore. I can't ask him. But even that, right? So when it comes to things like water, they're very much almost impossible to privatize. When it comes to things like prisons, it's really just probably an area that shouldn't have been privatized. Now, where does that line get drawn? And that's where things become blurry and gray. But I think by at least looking at the examples of prisons and waters, hopefully it can help us understand the working of the free markets in other areas as well. Your homework tonight, here's what I want you guys to do. We're starting to come to the tail end of this, just like pros and cons of the free market. We spent a lot of class time on this, and we're moving towards the end. We're not quite finished yet, but I want you to all ask one question about the free market. Think of a question, like a question you really want to know the answer to, right? Maybe it's something we talked about that you don't understand. Maybe it's something we haven't touched upon at all. You can be sassy with your question or not. I don't, just like ask a legitimate question that you truly want me to answer. Think about it, send me an email, and I'll see you guys on the internet.